Hello and welcome. This is Deep Dive and I'm Tiffany Meier. And for those wondering, we have launched an account on Rumble. It's under the same name and I'll also put a link down below. And for those who wanted more on Lincoln and how that relates to the present, we'll explore that topic a little later in this episode. But first, lots of developments in the Texas lawsuit against 4 battleground states, saying these states unconstitutionally changed election laws and thus the results should be overturned. Let's delve in. All eyes seem to be on Texas as more and more states either join or oppose. So far, 39 states have taken stances, 18 Republican attorney generals filing briefs backing Texas, and 20 Democratic attorneys general opposing. And 5 other states with Republican attorney generals have not taken action. These are Idaho, Alaska, Wyoming, New Hampshire, and Kentucky. Idaho's attorney general says he's declining to join, while the Idaho Republican Party, on the other hand, is standing with Texas. They announced they will file an amicus brief to join. And 106 House Republicans have backed the Texas election lawsuit. The lawmakers wrote in their brief, quote, "In the months before the 2020 election, those rules were deliberately changed by both state and non-state actors," adding the clear authority of those state legislatures to determine the rules for appointing electors was usurped at various times by governors, secretaries of state, election officials, state courts, federal courts, and private parties. The state of Texas had asked the Supreme Court on Tuesday to allow them to sue Pennsylvania, Georgia, Michigan, and Wisconsin in an attempt to protect the integrity of the 2020 election. And also in support of Texas, Pennsylvania's House Speaker and Majority Leader and 24 state senators have filed briefs with the Supreme Court against the state of Pennsylvania and in support of the Texas lawsuit. Some of Michigan's state legislators have asked the Supreme Court for permission to join Texas's lawsuit against their own state. At the same time, the 4 defendant states, at the request of the Supreme Court, submitted their brief on the 10th or yesterday. Pennsylvania calling the claims of fraud as, quote, baseless, and saying it's not up to the courts to pick the next president. Georgia, Michigan, and Wisconsin say Texas has no right to interfere in the state's way of conducting an election and that the Supreme Court shouldn't take up the case. But all the responses avoided directly addressing the core issue of the Texas lawsuit, the unconstitutional manner in which the 4 states conducted this election. Instead, they repeatedly emphasized that the Supreme Court should not change the outcome of the presidential election. But it seems if the presidential election is unconstitutional, then it's not a real choice of the people. This comes as 22 states and territories filed a brief opposing the Texas lawsuit. In just 2 days, a judicial war between the 2 ideologies in the United States has begun around the fundamental understanding of the Constitution. This is a historical judicial war. An event comparable that comes to mind in American history is probably the Civil War, which occurred from 1961 to 1965. From this point of view, Trump and Lincoln both share some similarities. They were both elected in a situation of great social division. As for President Trump, in the 8 years of the Obama administration before him, what's called the radical leftist ideology was strongly pushed forward, while what's known as the more conservative or traditional values were quashed. That's led to what's been known as the silent majority. Trump's election then becomes a revolt of the silent majority. In other words, Trump becoming president placed him directly in the middle of 2 warring ideologies in the United States. Now, looking at history, before the presidential election in 1960, the South wished to take slavery into the Western territories, Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah, while the North was committed to keeping them open to white labor alone. Meanwhile, the newly formed Republican Party, whose members strongly opposed the westward expansion of slavery into new states, was gaining prominence. The election of a Republican, Abraham Lincoln, as president in 1960 sealed the deal. His victory without a single Southern electoral vote was a clear signal to the Southern states that they had lost all influence. Feeling excluded from the political system, they turned to the only alternative they believed was left to them, secession. According to the South's understanding of the Constitution, the states agreed to be in this republic in order to, quote, form a more perfect union. If they feel that this republic is no longer suitable to them, they can secede. The election of Lincoln led to the secession of 7 states in the South before his inauguration: South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. From December 20th, 1960 to February 1st in 1961, they then formed the Confederate States of America. The situation in the country was tense. Lincoln wanted to avoid a civil war. In his inaugural address on March 4, 1861, he appealed for the preservation of the Union. He called for compromise. He promised he would not initiate force to maintain the Union or interfere with slavery in the states in which it already existed. Soon after, Lincoln received word that Fort Sumter, located in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, would have to be resupplied. The situation presented a problem, as tensions between the North and the South were very high. Resupplying the fort might inflame the situation because it was located in a slaveholding state. Yet Lincoln, in his inaugural address, had promised that the Union would not give up control of federal territory, such as Fort Sumter. The fort was resupplied, and Lincoln refused to evacuate it. The Confederates attacked the fort on April 12, 1861. Within a little over a month since his inauguration speech, the Civil War had begun. And President Lincoln was thrust into the middle of one of the country's greatest crises. By then, 4 more states declared secession: Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. If you look back at Lincoln and now Trump, there are similarities in many of the issues they face. At the time, Lincoln was in the vortex of the Civil War, and Trump currently is in the vortex of conservative American values and leftist forces, 2 different ideologies. Another similarity, the media landscape. On November 13, 1860, Memphis Daily Appeal wrote, "Within 90 days from the time Lincoln is inaugurated, the Republican Party will be utterly ruined and destroyed. His path is environed with so many difficulties that even if he had the ability of Jefferson and the energy of Jackson, he would fail. But he is a weak and inexperienced man, and his administration will be doomed from the commencement." The Civil War has continued for the whole tenure of Lincoln's first term. He was attacked by the media constantly. During his re-election campaign in 1864, New York Herald wrote, "His election was a rash experiment. His administration is a deplorable failure. As President of the United States, he must have enough sense to see and acknowledge he has been an egregious failure. One thing must be self-evident to him, and that is under no circumstances can he hope to be the next President of the United States. He should retire from the position to which in an evil hour he was exalted." According to Edward Everett, Lincoln was, quote, "evidently a person of very inferior caste or character, wholly unequal to the crisis." New York lawyer George Templeton Strong called Lincoln a barbarian, Scythian, Yahoo, or guerrilla, and he is, quote, "universally an admitted failure, has no will, no courage, no executive capacity, and his spirit necessarily infused itself downwards through all departments." That is some strong language right there. Back then, as now, the media did not hesitate to launch a full frontal attack on Lincoln or Trump. But the biggest difference is that the 2 men had different levels of control over the government. Trump faced a lot of attacks from a wide range of areas, including leaked information, what's known as the Russiagate or Spygate investigation, and even impeachment. Lincoln, meanwhile, didn't face quite the same amount. Instead, in the first months of his presidency, Lincoln spent a great deal of time on forming his administration with people he trusted. With the loyalty of his government, Lincoln led the Union and survived the difficult first 3 years of war. The difficulties Trump encountered were much greater than Lincoln's. First of all, the bureaucracy in modern society has never been stronger. Historically, the United States is supposed to have a government of the people, but now it seems more like a government of experts. The career officials are not elected, but they have formed a formidable system and network of their own, and can significantly influence the governments in every level. They severely limit a president's ability to govern. During this election, these anti-Trump forces in various government agencies, including the Department of Justice and the United States Postal Service, have demonstrated just how wide these forces are. Nowadays, big tech has also waded in. Google, Twitter, Facebook have appeared extremely hostile to Trump and seem to block him relentlessly. We can go more in depth next time about big tech and Trump. On the international stage, President Trump has been opposed for his America First policies and for his strong push to return to traditional American values. There's been signs the election is interfered with by foreign governments, including Venezuela, China, and Iran. Trump is facing a full range of enemies, yet he does not have a tight control over the government like Abraham Lincoln did back then. The government and the military were loyal to Lincoln and obeyed his commands. That is why Lincoln could deal with the resistance forcefully on every level. Just as President Trump rails against what he calls fake news, President Lincoln felt that a significant front in his war to preserve the Union was against the news media. This made Lincoln highly critical and skeptical of the media. He was also much tougher and more aggressive with the media than anyone could imagine in the modern era. This included shutting down over 300 newspapers and imprisoning journalists who supported secession from the Union. Lincoln also ordered the arrest of Ohio Congressman Clement Vallandigham for the crime of speaking out against the war. Chief Justice of the U.S. Roger Taney ruled that Lincoln had violated the U.S. Constitution when he illegally suspended the writ of habeas corpus. After hearing this, Lincoln signed an arrest warrant to have the Chief Justice of the U.S. arrested, although the warrant was never served. Lincoln was forceful against all those who opposed him, and he understood the importance of law and order to society. Lincoln hated mob rule, and he believed that the government had a duty to act to protect people and property from mob violence. In January 1838, Lincoln gave a speech titled "On the Perpetuation of Our Political Institutions," in which he described the mob as the enemy of law-abiding citizens. When Lincoln became president, Maryland was a state that was home to nearly 90,000 slaves. Many people were sympathetic to the South. In the weeks after the 1860 election, many people in Maryland thought Maryland would soon secede. As the president-elect, Lincoln passed through Baltimore on his way to Washington. Private detective Allen Pinkerton convinced him to pass through at night to avoid assassination attempts. Most importantly was Maryland's geography. Washington, D.C. was surrounded by two states. In the south was Virginia, and remaining there, borders were surrounded by Maryland. Virginia was apparently attempting to secede. If Maryland seceded, then the whole of D.C. would be surrounded by the Confederacy. Once the capital of the United States no longer exists, the Union would be in danger. Therefore, Lincoln decided to keep Maryland in the Union with all means. At the beginning of the Civil War, the Southern sympathizers in Maryland attacked the 6th Massachusetts Regiment as they passed through Baltimore. Maryland Governor Thomas Hicks, Baltimore Mayor George Brown, and Marshal of Police of Baltimore George Kane decided to destroy the railroad bridges around Baltimore to prevent Union troops from passing through the city. Days after the Baltimore riots against Massachusetts and Pennsylvania militia, some representatives of Maryland rushed to D.C. to advise Lincoln not to use force against those people, no matter what they did, because it would cause bloodshed. Lincoln replied, "You gentlemen come here to me and ask for peace on any terms, and yet have no word or condemnation for those who are making war on us. You express great horror of bloodshed, and yet would not let a straw in the way of those who are organizing in Virginia and elsewhere to capture this city. Go home and tell your people that if they will not attack us, we will not attack them. But if they do attack us, we will return it, and that severely." On April 27th, Lincoln authorized suspension of the writ of habeas corpus between Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. In July, Union troops flooded into Maryland and seized control of Annapolis and Baltimore. Baltimore Mayor George Brown, the entire city council, Marshal of Police George Kane, and all the police commissioners, as well as U.S. Congressman Henry Meier, were arrested and imprisoned at Fort McHenry. According to scholar Mark Neely, more than 14,000 civilians were arrested and imprisoned. It was Lincoln's strong measures that saved the entire republic at the time, but now the enemies Trump faced are many and way too powerful. In addition, Trump has the broad support of a lot of people, but he does not have the strong control of the government. Many people are asking why Trump does not issue executive orders to deal with election irregularities. But keep in mind, the executive order itself is not a law passed by Congress. So once an order comes out, if some court considers it illegal, the court has the power to injunct it. This is why almost every executive order issued by Trump has been blocked by some activist judges. Therefore, the executive order may not be much effective without a strong administrative power. In addition, some people say that the military at least seems to be loyal to President Trump. Actually, we can't be sure about that. But on the issue of the military, back then in the Civil War, it was a fight on the battlefield. Today, it is a fight in court between two ideologies and their different interpretations of the Constitution. The Supreme Court's decision will determine the future of the United States. But what do you think? Let me know below. Thanks for watching today's episode of Deep Dive. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm Tiffany Meier, and see you soon.